A very warm welcome to everyone on this episode of Beyond the Loch. Today we are delighted to be joined here at Loch Ness Hub by George Simpson, former owner of Loch Ness Travel, amongst many other positions, and probably locally well known as not only a local taxi driver but also his caber tossing skills, shall we say, from the Glen Urquhart Highland Games. George, a huge welcome to Beyond the Loch.
Thank you.
To kick us off, George, I realise that everybody again in the community here will be more than aware of who you are, but for our viewers across the pond and beyond, perhaps a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, well, I left Inverness High School in the 5th year and joined an apprenticeship as a central heating ventilating draftsman with an Aberdeen-based company, JTL Parkinson's. So I served my five years apprenticeship, became over the 13 years chief draftsman, and then they decided the company would move back to Aberdeen. And at that time I was playing semi-professional football for Inverness Thistle and goals, and I thought, no, I'm not going back to Aberdeen, I'm staying put. Cut a long story short, I got a job as Northern Area Display Advertising Executive with the Press and Journal for 6 years. And then after that, I was handling Crane Dick's advertising account, and they asked me to join them as a commercial salesman. So from there on, I worked after 13 years, became general manager, and then Leyland became short of money, and then DAF bought them over, and that was the end of British Leyland for me. A lot of the companies like Scania, Volvo, no matter how good a salesman you were, selling in benefits, whether it was 6 miles to the gallon for a 32, 38 ton tractor unit, or 8 miles to the gallon, it was always bottom line. And these big companies were subsidising deals, which Leyland couldn't afford. So you were knocking your head against a brick wall.
Yep.
So that's what made me decide I'm not going into commercial sales again. Although I had 2 years working from an office in the house in West Lewiston for DF Commercial's ERF trucks, and my company car was a 32-ton Arctic, which sat outside the house for most of the time when it wasn't on demonstration. And then that sort of petered out, sales didn't materialise, and I thought, right, that's it, what am I going to do? So after a long period of thought and such like, I decided, tourism, Loch Ness Travel, Drum the Rocket, capital of Loch Ness, go for it. And that's where it came from.
That's where Loch Ness Travel was born.
Yes. And obviously the taxi started with Loch Ness Travel, and that was the initial input. Then after that, 4 or 5 years down the line, 2002, the Great Glen Way was officially opened. Well, I was doing the Great Glen Way a couple of years before that, before the Highland Council took over and before it was waymarked.
Yep.
So I had a wee bit of insight of what was going on, and it worked well.
Great. Just for our viewers at home, maybe tell a little bit of what the Great Glen Way is.
The Great Glen Way, it's a long distance trail, which most people can do with 5, 6, 7 days. And it's one of the only trails, to my way of thinking, that people who are interested in walking outdoors, it's an easy insight into other long distance trails, because the first 3 days from Fort William to Fort Augustus is fairly flat on with the Caledonian Canal, etc., and Loch Lochy. After that, you're up and down, as you well know, because you've done it yourself. So, yeah, that's how that came about. And luckily for Drum the Rocket, the benefit to them, for the accommodation providers, was the fact that most of them will not walk 20 miles in one day, which means the economy for the local community, accommodation-wise, was going to double, because it meant them staying 2 nights instead of the normal 1, which had done all the way from Fort William.
Yeah, all that sales training didn't go to waste,
no,
George.
No.
So again, just perhaps expand a little bit on what Loch Ness Travel served for the long distance trails. So touching on the baggage transfers, which we now.
Yeah, well, Loch Ness Travel, part and parcel of that was the Great Glen Way baggage shuttle and support, which was part and parcel of Loch Ness Travel. And then I was involved with taxi work for walkers from Drumnadrochit to Blackfold, for example, which was problematic because I was supposed to be in Fort William in the morning to pick bags up, so I couldn't be in two places at once. So luckily, a colleague who's a taxi business in Fort William, he did the bottom end, Fort William to Speenbridge, occasionally up to Invergary to help me out. So he was part and parcel of it, subcontract-wise.
Yeah, yeah. We should say again for the viewers, Loch Ness Hub, or as we are now known, Loch Ness Hub and Travel, bought over the Loch Ness Travel business from yourself.
Yeah.
Perhaps you'd talk a little bit about that, George, and how that came about.
Well, it was an age thing, really. I started the business in 1991 and eventually sold it to yourselves, Loch Ness Hub Limited, in August 22, which was the final payment of a 3-stage payment, which I agreed to. I had people interested like Inverness Taxis and the main baggage handlers on the West Highland Way from Mulgai to Fort William. I had meetings with them. And at the end of the day, with likes of Caroline Wilson, Susan Clark, Gordon Finlay, I thought, right, go for the local community. Any profits generated will go into Drumnadrochit and surrounding area, other than going out with the area.
Absolutely, yeah. And again, for our viewers at home, the ability to be able to take over that business was cemented the business plan, which allowed all the funding that was come forward for Loch Ness Hub,
Yeah.
and the takeover of the information centre, which the community now own. George, in the setting up of the baggage transfer company, I'm sure you must have faced a number of challenges along the way. Anything that sticks in the mind, or
have you got 2 hours to spare?
Keep it short.
No, well, luckily my wife was quite good at handling bags. Going from the Great Glen Way, other trails expanded, like the African Tailway. Originally from Drumnadrochit to Glenelg, but a lot of people want to do a coast to coast. They'll start in Inverness and do part of the Great Glen Way to Drumnadrochit, then go up Glen Urquhart. I couldn't be at the end of that trail at Kintail and be moving walkers up to Blackfold with a taxi bus. So there was many people involved, local businesses like Street Coaches, Bill Ross, my colleagues in Inverness with taxi buses. I subcontracted them to assist.
Yep.
And that, bear in mind there was 20 odd walking agencies that I'd nurtured over the years and passed over to yourselves. And I take it that you've increased that number.
We're trying hard, George. We're trying hard.
Yeah. But
you laid the groundwork, and obviously we were very lucky to also inherit Jim Molyneux. Perhaps
your brother-in-law.
Your brother-in-law, and who is a legend of the trail, of the Great Glen Way. Again, perhaps tell us a little bit about how that came about.
Yeah, well, Jim, a partner of my late sister-in-law, when he moved in to the village, he was looking for work. He was originally a postman, and then before that he played professional rugby league football for Wigan Warriors, and I used to watch him on television refereeing rugby matches, so he's well known down in Lancashire. So I said to Jim, how do you fancy doing baggage for me on the Great Glen Way? No problem. So I give him the minibus. That's yours, fully insured, off you go. So he took to it like a duck to water.
Yeah, obviously all those years.
Obviously being an ex-post, it certainly helped, you know. And then from there, the East Highland Way started from Fort William up to Aviemore. So he was down there anyway. So a dog leg from Speenbridge up to Aviemore, towards Aviemore, was no real problem. It just meant it was going to be an hour later and getting bags back to Drumnadrochit ahead of the walkers. But everything worked in perfectly.
All those years of running on the rugby fields obviously made Jim very fit. We're delighted that he's still with us to this day, and approaching into his, he'll not thank me for this, but into his 75th year, and he's truly an inspiration to us all, certainly to all the young ones here. Absolutely. George, as mentioned at the beginning, as well as your background, famous as much as everything else you do in the village here in the community. I know you had the logo on the side of your vehicles of the Loch Ness monster tossing the caber, and you competed at what was probably the highlight of the calendar year here in Glen Urquhart Highland Gathering and Games.
Nothing truer.
Can you possibly tell us a little bit about that? And
Well, you can't go and practice tossing the caber. It just doesn't happen.
it's frowned upon.
No, but luckily, I was fairly sports orientated, and I was senior schools champion at the high school before I left. And when I moved out here, I've been drum the rocket 52 years now, long time. And I've been competing in Glen Urquhart Highland Games for 40 years. And I stopped 2011, and I had a heart attack in 2013 in January in Tenerife. So just as well I stopped. So that is an ongoing issue, but I'm controlling that, no problem at all.
Great to hear.
But the highlight of the year, as you said, was the Glen Urquhart Highland Games. Everybody who lived here, born here, stayed abroad, always converged and drummed the rocket for that particular weekend. Absolute magical. And with the local Royal British Legion Pipe Band in Inverness, it was the last performance of the season for them, so they...
And what a performance they put on.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, it cost me a fortune.
You had also, you touched on the pipe band there. I know from being involved in the Highland Games that your friends from across in Zurich, would you want to maybe tell our viewers a little bit about the pipe band coming over, and also for the Hogmanay Festival?
Yeah, well, that's my wife, myself, Ian Urquhart, Caroline Urquhart, Drambuie Farm at that time. Mary Beedham Tramps, who else? Blamore,
Fiona, many others.
Yes, and there was sort of 5 of us, and we resurrected the Loch Ness Hogmanay Festival, and that started before Inverness even had one, and they were a bit peeved that we were first on the go for Loch Ness Hogmanay Festival, and luckily we had friends from Switzerland staying, and we couldn't get a pipe band locally because they're all pre-booked. So they said, oh, we've got friends in Zurich who pipe. So, long story short, the Zurich Caledonian Pipes and Drums of Zurich came across under their own steam, and we paid them a token fee. Some bed and breakfast people put them up, courtesy.
Fantastic.
Absolute brilliant response. And what was happening was that the businesses decided to keep open in the winter time, because normally in winter time it's a no-go area, drum the rocket. Take the money from the tourists in the summer, winter time we don't want to know. But luckily they all give us their support.
We will clarify that, George. We're quite keen to move towards year-round tourism, so maybe a fresh approach nowadays.
Well, it is now. I mean, luckily with all the long-distance trails sort of centralising in drum the rocket, it more or less an all-year-round season.
Yeah, I was talking to a good friend of yours, Julie, over at Gemini Walks recently, and we were looking back at the years, and perhaps we touched on the Highland Games there, and the season for the walkers just used to finish the minute that the Highland Games were over.
Yeah.
And now we're moving in towards November with the walkers, and we've just moved our first people on the trails this week, which is fantastic.
Good.
Yeah, we certainly should show our appreciation for that groundwork, that skills, everything that you brought to Loch Ness Travel, and we're delighted to continue with all the agents that you brought on board.
I'm glad you're continuing it.
Absolutely. So just, you've touched on tourism there in the community. How do you feel tourism in the village and surrounding area has evolved over the years?
Drum the rocket expanded greatly over the last 10 years, I would say. I mean, me being a local taxi, I knew most of the people involved. Now, I'm struggling. There's new people coming in. I haven't a clue who they are. And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I don't think Drumnadrochit can cope with that upsurge of residents with the new housing scheme across the road at Springfield, for example. The school won't cope. Doctor surgery, there's some problems, not coping. Hopefully it'll all work itself out in the end.
Yeah, there's definitely a balance to be struck there, I think. And I think the encouraging thing is that there's more people looking for work. So in terms of keeping tourism going on a year-round basis, we're certainly attracting new people, which is fantastic. George, again, for our viewers who are not at home, you're also very, very famous for having a cabin in your garden, which has a vast array of malt whisky, and I'm sure you've had many memorable and maybe not so memorable moments in the cabin. Any particular ones? Any famous people?
I've had a lot of the Loch Ness Hub committee members. In for a night. That was good. One or two of the walkers who were in the Loch Ness Inn found their way across the road at that time to the cabin. And it was always a whisky journey. You know, it was never one particular whisky. It was a whisky journey, and you went from Scapa, Highland Park, all the way down to Murrayshire, sometimes down to Fort William. And by the time the evening finished, you know, you're well oiled by that time.
It was nearly morning.
Yes, and ready for walking, you know, and not a heavy breakfast.
Yeah, I think it's important to highlight that is true Highland hospitality. The fact that these were your customers on the Great Glen Way, baggage transfers, etc., and bringing them into your home, I think that really
well, one person you know particularly well, Neil Lapping, Max Adventure, one of the leading walking agencies. I did Neil's baggage and bikes. He was over a few years ago now. Did half the Great Glen Way on mountain bike and then walked the other half. And who the company he was with was these American agents along with our European agents. So of course they ended up in the house. The cabin wasn't built at that time, but doing the same thing. Fantastic. Whisky journey. So Neil and I go back a long way.
Yeah,
and I think he's still one of the major players.
Yeah, absolutely, and they've just gained B Corp status, which is fantastic for Max Adventure. We were delighted to be a part of that, play a very small part in it in terms of everything that they do for communities across Scotland through the West Highland and Great Glen Way and beyond.
Okay, before we go any further, you were mentioning the Swiss Pipers?
Yep.
Well, I've got Shorty and his girlfriend Maria coming across 17th to 20th of next month. Shorty is a piping instructor.
Okay.
And he's been here before. Initially, when we first started the Loch Ness Hog Marais Festival, he was one of the leading lights. He now coaches pipers in Switzerland, and he goes across into Germany and coaches the Heidelberg Pipe Band.
Amazing.
So he's with me for a couple of days, so I'll introduce you to him.
Absolutely, if you bring him along, and I'm sure my colleague Grace would be delighted to.
He's got his pipes with him as well. I made sure of that.
Even better. There seems like a YouTube short just in the making there. George, very finally, if you had one piece of advice for anyone that is perhaps thinking of starting out in tourism in today's industry, what would that be?
Do your homework. Make sure there is a need, a requirement for whatever way you're operating. And if anything works out well, go for it. Don't hesitate.
I think that's fantastic advice and a fabulous place to end. George, thank you very much. A pleasure as always.
Okay, Russell.
And we'll look forward to perhaps having you back again sometime towards Highland Games at the fourth Saturday in August.
The cabin's been resurrected in the new house.
There you go. All our viewers are invited. Thank you very much, George.
Thank you.